We are reflecting after the sermon and the study of 1 Samuel 26. We are going to be in Matthew. I'm going to briefly just read a couple verses of Matthew 5, but then we're going to camp out mostly in Matthew 18. But just to remind ourselves for this week, what we read about and reflected on was David once again finds himself being hunted by Saul, once again has the opportunity to retaliate, and once again chooses to essentially forgive Saul. And in the sermon, I essentially ended by saying that David is a picture of Jesus, and that David understood that his forgiveness that he experienced from God and he desired from God should be reflected in his relationships in the way that he offered forgiveness towards others. I mean, essentially, he treated people the way he wanted to be treated. So I want to look at Jesus now, though, because again, it's important to recognize that David essentially forgave Saul for trying to kill him 2 chapters ago, and now once again, Saul is trying to do this again. And so how do we navigate forgiveness? And the reality is, if we're going to do it well as Christians, we're going to have to accept that people who wrong us may wrong us again. And so I just want to look at this idea because this idea is incredibly important and powerful, and our culture is really struggling with it. I believe as we have essentially jettisoned Judeo-Christian ethics, we are left with an innate sense of injustice and blame, and our culture is really kind of, I would say, addicted to it. And I would say that the human heart is also very prone to essentially feeling self-righteous. And yet Jesus, when he taught us how to pray, when his disciples asked him, said, "Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And in that prayer, it's all about God delivering and protecting and sustaining and bringing his kingdom in heaven to be with us and to bless us. There's one little thing we're supposed to do, and that is to forgive other people like we have been forgiven. And so it's important to acknowledge that Jesus is saying, if you want to follow me, and if you want to be a Christian, and if you essentially want to bring heaven onto earth, the only thing you're supposed to do when we're praying to God and trying to be connected to God and participating with bringing heaven on earth is forgiveness. That's an immense task, but it is essentially our primary role is reconciliation. He will bring this home again in Matthew 5, which is where I briefly just want to look at in Matthew 5, 26 to 24. It says, "So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift before the altar and go. First be reconciled with your brother, then come and offer your gift." This is amazing. How many of us in church should not be going to church, but should be going to be reconciled with people who have things against us? And it's important to acknowledge this. Jesus is essentially saying it would be better that you relationally try to repair relationships, or in the 12 steps, sweep your side of the street rather than coming to worship me. And in fact, what he's linking is this idea that if we're going to bring heaven onto earth, we need to try to be in right relationship with everyone as best we can. All right, so now I want to jump to Matthew 18, which is where we're going to camp out. And so, starting in verse 15, Jesus teaches, "If your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault." Now, this is linked to forgiveness because Jesus will later tell a story about forgiveness. But it's important that a part of being reconciled is to actually go and confront one another. And this is something, as I was thinking about it this week, that I really struggle with doing. Frequently, I will try to forgive someone, but I will not go to them and confront them. My personality type is one that likes to keep peace. And so I have a tendency to be passive and want people to like me. The other personality type is the kind of the headstrong, outspoken people who can kind of be bullies. I'm the wimp. But in this verse, it's saying, if someone sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained a brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, and every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. It's important to note that if it is that big of a deal, then you're going to bring people, and if it's not, then you're just going to let it go. But this is important. If they don't listen, if he refuses to listen to him, tell it to the church. Now, this is something that I have used with people when they bring up things against people. Usually, frequently, I will say, Okay, well then let's go talk to them together. I'd be happy to talk and we can all talk together. Or is there anyone else you would like to bring if when they say, "Oh, I talked to them and they didn't listen." And usually, honestly, those people back down. To me, which is important. If it is that big of a deal, Jesus is saying it's Jesus essentially giving us protocol to really recognize how to deal with things. And notice we are all talking to each other. It begins privately and then we expand. If he refuses to listen to him, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind up on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if two of you agree about anything they ask, it will be done by them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among them. Then Peter came up to him. Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Now it's important. Peter's been listening to Jesus talk about forgiveness for a while, ever since Matthew 15, when Jesus taught him the prayer. And so he's been thinking about this for a while. And he's being very gracious. You know, it's frequent that I and other people kind of poke fun. Gail Irwin loves to poke fun at Peter. But when I thought carefully about what he was actually saying is, the question I had to ask myself is, how many times have I forgiven someone who's sinned against me for the same thing over and over again? 7 is a lot. 7 is very generous. If someone kept wronging you, if a brother kept wronging you 7 times, that's a lot. And in the rabbinic teaching of the day, they just said 3. You know, after 3 times, give it up. So he's being generous. Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. And there are different interpretations on that. Some versions say 7 times 7. But the point is 7 is the number of completeness. And so Peter's saying, oh, should I offer 7 times this number of completeness? And Jesus is essentially saying, no, a bajillion times. On and on and on. He's basically telling him, you should just be forgiving constantly. Now, this is hard. And then he tells a story. And I told this story on Sunday, but the story essentially is a servant owed a king $20. Not $20, excuse me. The servant owned a king bajillion dollars, and he couldn't pay, and so he was put in prison. But before he was put in prison, he went to the king and pleaded and said, please forgive me. And the king said, all right, I'll forgive you. And then as that servant was leaving, he saw another servant who owed him $20, and he choked him and grabbed him and said, give me what I owe. And the guy said, I don't have it. And the servant said, all right, you're going to jail. So he put this guy in jail, and the other servant saw this and then told the king. The king brought the first servant back and said, what have you done? You will now be thrown in jail until you have paid the last debt. And so Jesus ends it with saying, so also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother. And then he says, from your heart. And so the whole moral of this story is that essentially we are programmed. God has forgiven us so much, infinite amounts. And if we have been given so much, if we've been given this forgiveness, then we need to give it to the people around us, no matter how many times they wrong us. Because the reality is they have not wronged us to the degree that you and I have wronged Jesus. And this is the key, that we really, how much has Jesus forgiven us? Is it a little bit, or is it everything? And I talked about this again on Sunday, but I'll bring it up. One of the hardest things for me to accept with God was that he would forgive me for my future sins. I understood him forgiving me for my past. I understood even for the day I was communicating with him about giving myself over to him. I was like, well, I understand you forgive me for the day, but what about the continual times I will over and over? Because I knew I'm probably going to mess up again. And what God said is, I forgive you for everything that you will ever do if you will accept me as your God. And so I did. And so the reality is Jesus has forgiven me for everything. There's not a single thing. Everything was paid for on the cross. And so I am completely free. I'm completely forgiven. I do not hold any debt to Jesus because he paid an immense cost to me. So how can I withhold these little petty things when people wrong me? The reality is I can't. And there's this really good quote that my mom shared with me from this guy who had been struggling with anxiety and depression for years. And what he finally realized was he was holding on to resentment. And what he said was, I'd been holding on. I'd forgiven 99% of the things that had been wrong to me, but I kept 1% to myself. And what he finally realized was, as long as he kept on and clung to 1% of unforgiveness, he was not truly free. It wasn't until he forgave 100% that suddenly he experienced an immense release and a freedom and a joy that he had never experienced before. And that, I believe, is truly what Jesus is calling to, and how we navigate forgiveness is we have no right to cling to everything. And I think naturally my heart wants to cling to unforgiveness. Naturally, I want to forgive some things but withhold other things. And yet at the same time, as we saw in the passage, and what we learned from Jesus is we have no right to do that. If Jesus has forgiven us for 100%, then we must. And it's a process. And here's the thing. We have to be constantly asking ourselves, do I need to go make it right? So we learned that. That was the first thing I read from Matthew 5. If you are going to church and you realize there is someone who has something actively against me and you have not tried to make it right, Jesus is saying, skip church, go make it right. It's an amazing call. How many of us need to do that? I mean, ideally you don't skip church, but if Jesus is saying it's more important that you would go try to reconcile yourself with your brother. And then what we looked at in the beginning of 18, in verse 15, if your brother has sins against you, go confront him. Don't be passive. So a big part of forgiving is to go to the person and say, hey, you did this, it hurt my feelings, or you did this and it wronged me, rather than stuffing it down. And then the other thing, the way that, again, the protocol he gave us, which was to allow other people into the situation, forces us to not essentially blame everyone for everything. Because if we go to someone else and say, hey, this guy did this to me, and your friend says, you know what, that's you being petty, you need to let that go, that will force you to be humble and hold you to be accountable. And so these are the things that we need to wrestle with. And really, if you're applying this into your life, you're going to find yourself hyper relational, essentially. That you are, forgiveness requires working in the relationships that you're in, which is a lot of work. And that's the thing about following Jesus is Jesus taking up your cross and following him requires that you love people well, and requires that you attempt to be in relationships with people well. And that requires being connected to them. And that requires, essentially, notice that both the two things that he called us to do in forgiving people is that or trying to be reconciled, is that we need to go talk to people, and that we need to share how we're feeling in our hearts. And that's humbling. It's humbling and it's scary, but that is the way he's called us to do. And so, again, like I said on Sunday, the first way that we are able to do this, we can't do it until we accept and understand that we are completely forgiven by Jesus for everything. And we really acknowledge that, in my opinion, we need to be very repentant and honest about our selfishness, because until we do that, I don't believe we're going to be willing to forgive other people's selfishness. If you are unwilling to look at yourself under God's microscope and recognize your sin, you will not be humbled enough to be able to forgive other people. And so I believe that the degree that you understand your forgiveness is the degree that you can actively and well, I'm not talking about salvation personally, but I do believe that you need to offer forgiveness. And so hopefully that was helpful. Jesus, I just thank you. I thank you for this opportunity to forgive. I pray if there are any relationships that I need to remedy and take care of, that you would highlight them to me in my heart and mind. And I just pray for our church that you would help us to be forgiving and gracious. In your name, amen. All right. Hope you have a great week, and hopefully I'll see you on Sunday.